Who better than Mosaab Baba, a Sudan researcher, to talk to us about the horrific events unfolding still in Sudan? And he may be able to tell me something about Nigeria too. Mosaab, very big welcome to you. For the first time, I think, to the mother of all talk shows. Very good to see you. Let's start, if we may, with Sudan. What is happening there and why?
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to be with you on the show. Sudan has had a long cycle of wars, and basically the main kind of arc of history that kind of caused these wars was Sudan's kind of, a victim of geography, but also being kind of at the front lines between, the global south and, the global north. That was kind of the classical view of Sudan, that conflict between the east and the west, and Sudan kind of being caught in the middle. Back in the late 70s, there was a switch, that coincided with the introduction of kind of the neoliberal era of empire. And Sudanese leaders have had to toe that line between, the U.S. policy and empire's policy and looking elsewhere for allies. This changed when the Bashir regime came, and they tried to put on a facade of being independent, even though they were still working with the World Bank and everything. And before them, of course, Nimeri was pretty much, the U.S. man in the region. But this then caused a lot of problems within Sudan, because these were autocratic regimes, but also ideological. It's a very Arab-centric, government from the Bashir days. This then, the reason South Sudan had such a long war is because they didn't want to be second-class citizens. This kind of spread then into the rest of Sudan, to the Nuba Mountains, into Darfur, where you started seeing rebellions happen because of the marginalization, because of the status as being second-class citizens. But a lot of this was in lockstep with kind of the larger U.S. policy. If you remember, in the late 90s, Sudan was on the list of the 7 countries in 5 years. So that created even more pressure on the Bashir regime. And, they kind of forced South Sudan, and a lot of it was by South Sudanese, declaring their own independence. But it was also kind of pushed by Western countries to separate Sudan. The problems never got solved. People remember the Darfur War in the 2000s, and people wonder kind of what happened to it, because there was, the Save Darfur movement, and it was, a little bit astroturfed, but the sentiment was real, the war was real, and the genocide was real at the time. But it was never resolved. There was no accountability. The ICC, of course, indicted Bashir and everything, but it was just, something to keep him more as a liability rather than actually solving the problem itself. But essentially, during the Darfur War in the 2000s, the Janjaweed won the war because they had the support of the central government, and, Bashir and the NCP and SAF actually incubated them. What made the problem even compounded was now how many foreign actors were actually supporting the RSF. So the European Union, in order to quell migration, actually did the Khartoum process in 2014 or 2015, and basically funneled arms and supplies to the RSF through the central government in Khartoum. So now you have this militia that was created by the Bashir regime and incubated by them, now strengthened by the European Union. The European Union say that they didn't support the RSF directly, but they supported the Bashir regime, which had the RSF as its main ground force in Darfur and all western points in Sudan. The Yemen war was also a huge problem because it started militarizing not only within the RSF, but also the official army. You know, the Yemen war was seen as a cash cow for the most impoverished areas in Sudan. And basically, it made the RSF grow exponentially. The other issue was that, you know, in 2014, Sudan switched from kind of being allies with Iran and China and Russia, and went exclusively into the fold of the Gulf Arab countries, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Egypt also was starting to play a very nefarious role in Sudan because of their problem, mainly with the Ethiopian dam, the GERD, and the clash over that. So Sudan externally has been kind of squeezed and broken by a larger neo-colonial, order, which now sees countries like the UAE as being one of the cornerstones of the new Middle East kind of, coalition and powerhouse. So when we talk about the multipolar world, now we have a central pole within the Middle East that actually has its own imperial ambitions. So this war actually came on the heels of, there was the popular mass movement in 2018 and 2019 that removed Bashir. This is the kind of the first time since Sudan's independence that you have a national consensus among different parts of Sudan and across different ethnicities and classes saying that they want democratic change. The push for democracy was always, in a lot of African circles, is seen as a Western-backed kind of agenda. In this case, it was the opposite. The people went out to the streets to remove Bashir after Bashir kind of folded to Western countries and started going and, even talks about normalizing with Israel and everything. So the West was kind of seeing Sudan as being now playing fair and playing ball and, playing its position. The movement in 2019 disrupted that and said, no, we want a sovereign country. We want our resources to be owned by Sudanese because that's a big part of it. Oil, when South Sudan was still part of Sudan, you have livestock, gold, gum arabic, agriculture is huge, food security for the Middle East. So, and not to mention the Red Sea as well, having a long coast on the Red Sea and all of the conflict around the Red Sea from competing nations, all from Russia all the way to the US, you have the UAE, Turkey, all kinds of countries wanting to set up shop along the Red Sea. So Sudan has a complicated past, but the kind of fascist nature of the Bashir regime for the past 30 years, and you can go back the past 40 years along with Nimeri, have kind of led to this break within Sudan. And unfortunately right now with the RSF being unleashed on the population, you now have the possibility of a third split where Darfur and Kordofan would split off from Sudan. There is a lot of pressure, of course, for the negotiations to happen between SAF and the RSF, but the human toll has been astronomically tragic. The over 12 million people displaced from their homes. There's hundreds of thousands of deaths, although the real tally is unknown. But the Sudanese civilian has been paying the price for the past 30 or 40 years on this. And unfortunately, the more you are in the margins of Sudan and belong to indigenous groups in Sudan, you're carrying a heavier toll of these wars.
To what extent let's try to drill down on the ontology here. To what extent is it Arab versus African, to what extent, I mean, the conduct of the RSF this week has been like ISIS on steroids. But do they share the ISIS mentality as well as the modus operandi? And if they were to further partition Sudan and take these areas, what kind of state would that be?
So the identity issue is a huge issue that's kind of been, a dark cloud over Sudan for a long time. And the Arab versus African dynamic is true, but it's much more complex than just, ethnicities going against each other. The RSF is made up of mainly nomadic tribes that are pastoralists and depend on grazing lands. You have most of the indigenous groups in Darfur. The non-Arab groups are agricultural groups. So then you have other issues like desertification. Pastoralists have to move further south, encroaching on farmers' land. So there is that dynamic that feeds into the existing kind of split between Arab and non-Arab. But this has been mainly pushed by the Bashir regime. The Arab-centric view of Sudan and the imposing of the identity and language and culture and everything has been something that the Bashir regime has kind of pushed and created this huge catastrophe since the days of South Sudan. So it's a bit complicated, but historically these groups have been living with each other side by side for thousands of years. Any issues that have to do with the economic issues of agriculturists and pastoralists were solved on a community level. So it's definitely the headline is correct, but there's an asterisk next to it to kind of unpack the more complicated nature. Now, yes, within the context of violence and violence on communities and how ruthless, it is reminiscent of ISIS. But instead of a hardline Islamist ideology, it's a very tribal ideology. So you don't the state under an RSF governance would be a disaster, because not only is there the ideology, but also the nature of the outfit itself. It's originally a criminal outfit that was set up by Bashir to quell rebellions, and they didn't care what kind of tactics they were using. Burning of villages, raping of women, displacement. This has been an ongoing saga for a long time in Sudan. And, any non-Arab minorities within that fold, we've seen what happened to the Masalit group in Western Darfur in June of 2023. And now we're seeing what's happening with Al-Fashir. And we as Sudanese, because we look at these videos, we see the rhetoric, we're listening to, Facebook Live and Clubhouse and the kind of rhetoric that's there, and it's a racist, genocidal rhetoric that comes out. But, the RSF didn't come up with this on their own. This was also shared by a lot of the leadership within the Bashir regime.
And what exactly are these Arab Gulf countries doing meddling in this grisly stew? Are they in it for the gold or what?
So the main culprit over here is the UAE. Egypt has a very nefarious role as far as kind of, coercing Sudan to move away from civilian rule and, wanting to influence Sudan and South Sudan. Egypt's ambitions are more contained within, the Nile Valley and all the countries along the White Nile and the Blue Nile and things of that sort. But the UAE has a bigger footprint. The UAE is truly the scarier ambitions, because it's not just Sudan. It's Sudan, it's South Sudan, it's Chad, it's their relationship with Addis Ababa and Ethiopia. It's working with countries like Kenya and Uganda. working with factions within Somalia, for example, supporting Puntland and Somaliland, and kind of encouraging their kind of self-determination. So they're really playing a bigger role in Africa to kind of divide and conquer and gain access to a lot of resources. You know, they're involved in the Congo as well. When you go around on the continent, you're going to see those UAE fingerprints in a lot of countries, unfortunately. And I think it's because there's a void that's been left. You know, African countries usually used to look at the East and the West. They used to look at the US and European countries for partnerships, for funding, for, you know, these kind of issues. And they used to look to the East for partnerships as well. You know, classically, you know, back in the days with the USSR, but now, you know, with China. And now it seems like the military world order from the West, it's retracting. So this creates some kind of space within the continent for other so-called partners to come in. So the UAE kind of recognized this, and to what extent this is coordinated between them and Washington and Tel Aviv is also a question mark. But we know that there's a very strong connection there. Even when you look at 2023 and 2024, when Netanyahu would come to the UN, he would have this map of the new Middle East, where he would include the Gulf countries, Egypt and Sudan exclusively. And this kind of goes in line with pressuring Sudan, Washington pressuring Sudan to join the Abraham Accords, for example. So the UAE is not doing this as a rogue state by itself. It's part of a larger coordinated kind of pro-US Israel policy within the region. But the UAE is spearheading that not only in Sudan, but in the entire region. As far out, their role in Libya, they're far out as the Sahel countries and how they've supported more of the nefarious actors over there. So it's a huge problem, but we're used to the classic look of imperialism, but we kind of need to, switch our view a little bit to start looking at who are the new actors in this neo-colonial order on the continent.
That's been really helpful, Mosaab. How can people follow you to take advantage of your wisdom on these matters? Are you on social media? How can people help your work?
Well, there's my previous colleagues at the Ayin Network. I think that's, I was working there for a long time. And that's kind of the best repository of reporting and coverage from the ground on Sudan. So it's 3ayin.com. That's Ayin Network. And yeah, I would push people towards that and really appreciate this opportunity. George, I'm a fan of the show, and thank you for giving some attention to this huge tragedy that we have.
The thanks are all due to you. You've cleared up many things. Thanks very much for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. I hope we get the chance to talk again.